Good morning. I'm Tiphanie Yanique, and this is...
Robert Antoni.
And our panel is called Claiming a Hybrid Language, Seeking Hybrid Forms, What is the New Global Caribbean Literature? And not all the panels have formal titles, but ours does intentionally because we are hoping to announce the Caribbean as a place not only of global literature, that our literature is and has always been global in its scope and in its ideas, but also that it is a literature that is always, and we think will continue to be, one of hybridity.
I wanted to begin with a very small but important precautionary note, and that is moving with this theme of multiplicity. The danger that I recognize in American publishing, but more so in kind of American celebrity profiling, to isolate a single voice to represent a single island nation or linguistic region. You know, what I'm talking about is Marlon James is Jamaica, Edwidge Danticat is Haiti, Junot Diaz is DR. Most dangerous of all, V.S. Naipaul is Trinidad. If there is one adjective that I would choose to describe this region, it would have to be complex. I'm assuming that all of you are familiar with the history, but it's the most complex region on the planet, possibly, even though, as we've heard over and over again, we're talking about small island spaces. But it takes many voices to represent each one of these small island nation states. And I think there's a great danger in choosing only one to represent, one of these spaces.
And we've seen so far that our great leader for the seminar, Arlo, has made it clear that not one writer will represent. There was that wonderful panel yesterday where we had 3 Jamaican artists representing a version of Jamaican literary output right now. But throughout the course of these days that we've all been together, we've seen versions of multiplicity and hybridity presented in various kinds of ways. So part of our panel also is to put language to some of what we've already been noticing in these past couple of days. So for example, in Joshua's presentation yesterday, he gave us that wonderful image of Jay, the Trinidadian activist and cultural forebearer, who wore what he called a uniform. If you guys were here yesterday, you might remember the description of Jay as someone who wore the red turban, the white shirt, and the black pants, and that made him a walking Trinidadian flag. But where did he get this from? He gets the idea of wearing the turban from a Sikh he meets in England. So the idea that a Sikh he meets in England allows him to be the Trinidadian flag is actually a metatextual representation of this idea of hybridity that we think is organic to Caribbean culture and organic to our literature. Also yesterday, Brent, Andre, and Teju talked about the geographical hybridity and the intellectual hybridity, the idea that perhaps we are not even talking about land as a region, but as Teju said, the ocean itself as the region. On the panel with Kai, Nicole, and Marlon, they talked all eloquently and interestingly about class hybridity. Marlon spoke about having grown up in a working class neighborhood, but his father becoming a well-known lawyer on the island, and then him sort of catapulting into the higher echelons of society, but being in between those things at all times. But also the linguistic hybridity. And I love that if you guys were all here yesterday when Kai gave us the 5 different versions of English, right? That Caribbean persons are moving through sometimes within one conversation. And if any of you have overheard some of us chatting amongst each other, you'll hear us doing that in our registers. So this hybridity is something that has been present in our conversations. And for Bobby and I, in particular, we do this consciously in our writing.
Yeah, I wanted to speak for a bit about linguistic hybridity in terms of our use of the vernacular, which is omnipresent in Caribbean writing. I have to be careful, first of all, because I can really only speak about the West Indies. But I know that these same vernacular experimentations and movements are happening in the Spanish Caribbean. I know they're happening in the Franco-Caribbean, and I'm assuming that it's in the Dutch Caribbean as well. Just about every panel that we've heard here has referenced a book by an author, West Indian author by the name of Kamau Brathwaite. I don't think the book has been named, so I'm going to name it. It's called History of the Voice. And what that book is the first attempt by a writer from the region to articulate what we call the vernacular. Kamau called it nation language. The interesting thing about this book is it's old as the hills, like vernacular is old as the hills. It was actually published 35 or 40 years ago. So this is nothing new to West Indian writing. However, it's been evolving in, I think, very interesting ways. The vernacular is always posited against another language. And for West Indian writers, that other language is what we call proper English. That comes from the OED. It's static, sterile, whereas the vernacular is a living language. It's constantly reinventing itself, transforming itself in the same way that, you know, these writers are doing it in their work. I could go on forever talking about this, but the interesting aspect for me is that initially vernacular was considered very much a secondary language. It was restricted to quotation marks. It was primarily placed in the mouths of comic characters. Kamau calls them caricatures. However, the vernacular has slowly been claimed by Caribbean writers in a way that forces it to leak out of those quotation marks until they disappear altogether. And my contention is that what West Indian writers in particular have done is to flip the hierarchy that sets up between proper English and the vernacular, so that the colonizing, the controlling language then becomes the substrate, becomes the subverted language, and the primary language becomes the vernacular. We're seeing this, the primary example is Booker Prize winner Marlon James. He has a book written in multiple Jamaican vernaculars, but also, you know, High English becomes a vernacular. So for me, this is the sort of exciting project with hybridity that all of our writers are very much invested in.
In my work, I also flip the power structure. So in my novel, Land of Love and Drowning, it's a write back to a very well-known novel by a gentleman named Herman Wouk, who you guys might know. He wrote Cane Mutiny, among other Pulitzer Prize-winning novels, actually. But he's written one book called Don't Stop the Carnival. And in that novel, it's set, some people think it's set maybe in Key West. Virgin Islanders, which is where I'm from, we think it's set in the Virgin Islands. And we think it's set in St. Thomas specifically. And in his book is focused on the tourists who are coming to the islands. and he makes the islanders the secondary characters. So in my book, I've taken his exact characters and I flipped them, and I've made my main characters his secondary characters, and his main characters are my secondary characters. So that I've elevated the common people, the secondary people, in my case is the people who are brown and black and Asian and every kind of others, even queer characters, and I've made them the vibrant, fully fleshed out characters, and intentionally made his main characters flat and one-dimensional. So I think that is not new to me. I think that is something that Caribbean writers also have been doing, flipping this idea of who gets to have power. And we've done it with language, but we also do it with the body. And in my work, I am mostly interested in hybridity of body and hybridity of physical space. So there's lots of writers that I draw from specifically, like Edwige Danticat, who some of you have seen on stage already, who uses the land as a space of hybridity, but also writers like Jamaica Kincaid, who we've also seen, who uses the body as a space of hybridity. And actually, those two women writers are some of the most important influences on my work. I'm actually going to read an example, a passage from my novel. Bobby's going to follow me by reading a passage from his novel that exemplifies the hybridities that we're talking about. I'm going to stand to read from the podium because I'm a teacher, and I feel like that's what teachers are supposed to do. Thank you. So I'm reading from very deep in the novel, which writers normally don't do because it requires lots of introduction, but I won't do that. I'll just say a few things, which is that a protest is happening. The protest is called the BOMB, which is short for Beach Occupation Movement and Bacchanal, which is based on a real movement in the Virgin Islands, which forced the American government to make all our beaches in the Virgin Islands public. So in the Virgin Islands, there is no such thing as a private beach. Every beach must have public access from land and from water. And it's because of this movement that I'm dramatizing in my novel. So I'm just going to read a passage, but it's written from the perspective of the protesters. And in this passage, I'm really emphasizing the issue of hybridity of the body, specifically women's bodies, but also of the land, and how the beach itself, as a really important place in the Caribbean, is a space of hybridity. Security lined up along the water's edge with 6 feet between them as they had been trained and told. But as the boats came closer and the chanting became very clear, some of the security guards, overcome with love for their islands, stripped off their uniforms and swam out to join the protesters. They clambered into the boats where they stood out in their white briefs and their shiny black shoes. But that is when the real police revealed themselves. Those men, better trained and holding jobs that earned them health care, stayed in uniform and filled the spaces where the hotel's security guards were quickly evacuating. When the boat started singing towards the shore and the people of us who could swim started jumping overboard and making toward the sand, the police put their batons up, but they did so only half-heartedly. They were amused and proud, even as they grabbed the people by the shoulders and corralled them into one gathering out of the tourist way. VI people crazy, the officer shouted. After all, these people, the protesters, were their cousins or their aunts and uncles, or in some cases, their sisters and brothers, wives and husbands. Are you so crazy? The police said it singing, like crazy was the best thing to be. But that was not all. The Coast Guard was federal, and so they appeared as colonizers do in big ships. As soon as the little protester rowboats and motorboats had left the waterfront for their 5-minute voyage to Water Island, the Coast Guard boats were dispatched. It took the guard just about 10 more minutes to arrive. Their vessels were now out in the water, facing the crowd of the protesters who were held on the sand. Bearing down on the little boats were the people who hadn't jumped because they weren't yet confident in their swimming, now threw down anchors or cut off motors and tried not to look afraid. The Coast Guard commander got on a bullhorn and told those on the beach that they would be uncorralled, and told the ones in the boats that they would not be sunk, and told them all that they would not be arrested, but only if they agreed to go home. We already home. The people on the boats and the sand replied in unison as if it had been planned. The tourists on the beach were frozen in their fright. They seemed like huge sand sculptures, like Lot's wife, tropical style. They stared at the protest signs stuck in the sand and did not know that they were the leeches of the beaches. A revolution? Oh no, the natives were rebelling, but for what? Look how beautiful it was here. Who could not be happy here in this paradise? Who would revolt here? With the Coast Guard there now, the tourists moved slowly, hoping that if they gathered their towels and sunscreen bit by bit, that no one would notice them. And no one noticed them at all, because something else was happening, not bit by bit. A girl who had slipped out of the protesting crowd was rushing towards the water. She was doing a swim in, even though a lime in, which is our word for like hanging in, hanging out, is what they had planned. But still, this girl was right. To be able to go back and forth from water to land as you pleased, that was the thing. The back and forth was the beach. The girl was fully clothed, with strange pants wringing at her feet, but her hair was swimming behind her like an impossible school of barracuda. And though she was running to the water, it seemed as though she was running in every direction. She kicked off her sneakers just before streaming into the sea. Her beauty was so disturbing, so unusual, and so unfair that even the protesters lowered their voices. Even the police, now policing the water, slacked their arms and saw her slip through them like a fish. And then she was lifting her t-shirt off and flinging it into the surf and charging the ocean like a reverse Athena, sprouting inwardly back to her creator. So many, many metaphors. Yumi had not meant to expose herself. Perhaps she was coming into her gift. Perhaps she was going out of her mind. We old wives, we can't say for sure. Because when the t-shirt was raked off, so went her bathing suit top that had been underneath, and Jesus, Lord, what pillowy wonders her breasts were. As Yuvi dived under, every single person on the beach was filled with an ancient urge. They all flooded after her. For a full minute, everyone, tourists and natives and locals and Coast Guardsmen, and even the ones who just before swore they couldn't swim, now splashed like they were children, like it was a pure bacchanal, like it was Carnival Sunday and we were all one at the last lap. Everyone swimming, a miracle.
I'm going to stand also, not because I'm a teacher, but because whatever Tiphanie does, I do it too. So this is a very short section from my novel, As Flies to Watless Boys. And I'll tell you about the title because it's a good example of hybridity. It comes from a quote, a line in Shakespeare's King Lear, which is, "As flies to wanton boys are we to the gods, they kill us for their sport." So I have substituted wanton for the Caribbean, the Trinidadian vernacular word watless, which means wanton, means worthless, useless. So I am claiming that high important English text in the very title with my own, mongrel West Indian language. So this this is a historical novel, and there is one contemporary voice, which is that of the notorious director of the TNT National Archives, a Miss Ramsall, who has charge of the photocopy machine. And she forbids everyone to get near that machine except herself. Her voice is represented in the novel as a series of emails between Miss Ramsall and a Mr. Robot, her pronunciation of Robert. Mr. Robot may or may not bear some resemblance to the author. The emails concern Mr. Robot's various attempts to connive Miss Ramsall into giving him access to the photocopy machine. They also concern his attempts to seduce her, but in the end, it's Miss Ramsall who seduces him. Last thing I should tell you is that the language for these emails is what I call a Trini vernacular cell phone text speak. That's got to be vernacular. That's got to be hybridity, which means that it contains lots of numerals, abbreviations, and not a single full stop, which makes it a little difficult to read aloud. Dear Mr. Robot, you is a effing shitong, Mr. Robot, is what you is. All night long, too, we juking down the place like no tomorrow, and you playing so innocent. Never mind that juking was sweet too bad, and I can only admit how much I was liking it too. My tootie pulsating and twitching and smoking up a little bit so nice this morning when I reach inside here in the archives, and Miss Ramsall come telling me first thing what take place yesterday afternoon during my half day off. How you did come inside here toting you own personal Xerox machine, wherever the France you get it from. And you tells Miss Ramsall, Miss Samlal Singh, how I give you express permission to bring this machine inside the place like that. And you tell she how Miss Ramsall say you could copy out as much copies as you want to make your research for this crazy-ass novel you say you're writing. But that is only another one of you bold-faced lies and bullying and scheme is scheme. You're scheming she again to copy out your copies. And she tell you, no effing way, Mr. Robot. But you carry a big-ass machine inside the place regardless and plug the plug and commence to copying out your copies. But Miss Samlal Singh tell me how before the first 5 copies come out from you machine, whilst she was bawling down the place hysterical like I instructed to do in perilous situations like that, to shut down that blasted machine straightway, Mr. Robot. And Miss Samlal Singh tell me how first thing before you know it, all the visitors in the archives commenced to queuing up straightway in a long, long queue with all them people fighting you down now to copy out their copies upon your machine. And they was all shouting that if some blasted foreigner, Yankee-ass white man could copy his copies, then they could copy their own copies too. And Miss Rose's copy out, she copied for Guava Duff out last Sunday Gazette, and Mr. Hossain want to copy out a copy of Sunday Horse Races, Paddock's lineup from the Standard. And before you know it, there was a big lineup of Earl and Marlin and Kaz and Lawrence and Tiphanie and Kai and Nicole and all of them people, and they was bawling that if you don't let them copy out the copies, you would have upon your hands a race riot for equal and fair use of the photocopy machine in the TNT National Archives. So, Mr. Robot, you best listen good to me here, what I'm telling you, eh? And don't try that one again, you understand, eh? Because laws is laws, and rules is rules, and no personal portable photocopy equipment allowed inside, and you know it good enough, even though in truth, according to Miss Samlal Singh, that machine you was toting wasn't so small at all. But she said it was big as a barrel of Babash Bush rum, with you red face straining hard like you're making a caca now to carry this machine. That me and Miss Samlal Singh couldn't help ourselves from laughing a little bit at that one. And I hope it give you a hernia, Mr. Robot, just so long as it don't ruin the joking equipment, because that would be a shame in truth. Cordial, Miss Ramsol, Director, TNT National Archives. P.S. You could meet me at Pelican tonight at 9, same as usual. P.S.S. And I would be sure to wear my dental floss panties for you too.
I have to say something smart in response to that. I've heard Bobby read from that passage so many times, and it's so fucking funny every time. So obviously there's hybridity of language. He's using the vernacular. There is the woman who's in charge of the TNT archives. She's a librarian. She's a highly educated person, but she's choosing to use the vernacular, right? She obviously can employ standard English when she desires. That's what her master's degree would have allowed her. But she's choosing to use this language, and look how inventive and smart and fun it actually can be. We often don't think that the vernacular can do that. The other thing I think that's interesting about that section is that Bobby is like fluidly going between races and ethnicities. And this is something that Caribbean writers really have always done from Sam Selvin on forward. Selvin himself is an Indo-Trinidadian and a Trini of Indian descent, but many of his characters are of African descent or Afro-Trinis, and nobody ever batted an eye about that. And I think that's something that Caribbean writers continue to do, and we could have a whole panel maybe on how Caribbean writers cross racial lines comfortably, and how Caribbean readership and Caribbean audiences tend to be allowing of that, and why. But that's part of, I think, of our hybridity. We might argue that all of these characters are Caribbean, and that's why, although they are differently racially marked, we have access to them because they're still West Indian or Caribbean characters. We want to leave lots of time for questions, but I also want to say a few things about gender and also about hybridity of theory and craft. Yesterday there was the question that was asked of the panelists, can you talk about what are the roles of women in Caribbean literature and Caribbean culture? And I thought the panelists, specifically Nicole, gave a really smart, beautiful answer. But we thought we might say a few more things about that, because in the Caribbean, often the Caribbean writers who we have exported, the ones who were appreciated in Europe and America, were the male writers. But for most of us, we've been looking also towards some of our older women writers, and older I mean earlier women writers. So there would be no such thing as I think this fluency we all have with hybridity of language if there was not first Louise Bennett, who did radio programs and used the vernacular in poetry, which was something that we all know that Walcott has continued to do, but Louise Bennett was also doing this work on the popular stage. Dion Brand, who has been mentioned already, is someone who first told us that no language is neutral, that all languages come with their politic, and that we as Caribbean writers who are employing various vernaculars, but also many of us are employing various languages. And you'll see, especially with the writers like Juno Diaz or Edwidge Danticat or Achille Bejas, who are writing in the States but come from islands where English is not their primary language, that they are often just lifting Spanish or French into their work, or Creole into their work unapologetically, not even translating in the literature. and expecting us to move through different languages in one text. But Dion Brand was one of the first that told us that that's something that we as Caribbean writers should do and can do. So the women writers have been highly influential, but also Caribbean writers tend to be on the hybrid when it comes to form. We don't think it's a big deal that Edwidge Danticat is an essayist and a novelist. Nobody finds that unusual. Nobody thinks it's unusual that Walcott was a playwright and a poet. I also write fiction and poetry and essays, and that's something that in the region is really accepted and sometimes even expected. But I found as a professor in MFA programs in North America that there's a lot of attention to focusing on your one genre. And you are a poet, stay in your poetry corner and don't come over to the prose area. And if you're a fiction writer, don't go over to be a poet. But in the Caribbean, that back and forth is really something that we take for granted, I think. But we take it for granted when it also comes to theory. So you might have noticed, or maybe you haven't noticed, but it's the case that many of us who've taken the stage are academics. We are creative writers who write poetry and fiction and essays, but we are also operating in the world as theorists and professors of theory and criticism. So the idea that for the Caribbean writer that we are also operating as theorists is something that I think many of us take for granted, that our early writers were also doing. So C.L.R. James is doing the work of history and theory, and he's also creating the creative literature. And that's something that many of us have continued to inherit, that this hybridity of form is something that we do organically.
Since these seminars are in remembrance and honor of our father, Derek Walcott, I just thought I'd end with something that he always used to say, that the Caribbean person is a person of bold gesture. Caribbeans don't walk across the room, they dance across the room. Caribbean people don't wear solid colors. They wear beautiful, colorful clothing. But this is the I think the Caribbean essence, that grand gesture. And for me, the writing that's coming out of this region represents this grand gesture in the boldest ways imaginable. We're seeing it in Edwidge, we're seeing it in Junot Diaz, we're seeing it in Marlon James. And what I would like to do is kind of propose a future for radical hybrid forms growing out of the region. I would like to imagine a kind of multilingual, multi-gendered kind of work. And because I'm a novelist, I like to talk about the novel as being kind of the most malleable, eclectic, and class-blind of the literary forms. So in my own work and in the work of some of my, my fellow Caribbean writers, I'm seeing some really bold and wonderful experimentation. The new Caribbean novel I'm going to propose will move into such areas as the digital. You saw yesterday how I like to include visual images, but also I think that the internet is going to be embraced as a kind of tool to tell stories. How is the internet going to affect the way we write and receive stories? So I would like to imagine a kind of Caribbean novel that is all of these multiple things, in addition to being on the front edge of technology. of being also digital and just as thoroughly hybrid as the form can accommodate. This is the most radical form to represent the most radical kind of Caribbean reality.
Thank you. So we will take questions. We actually left a good amount of time for questions on purpose. We know most of the panels were so tight, so we left time for more expansive conversation. Yes?
Thank you very much. This has been kind of a revelation to me. I did not know many of the writers here before the conference. And I'm wondering, because of the multiplicity of language and the tonality of the language, how can a reader access that to the fullest? You know, you mentioned digital. What about audio? How do you think somebody best reads your book in whatever way the term reading can be expressed?
I think that's a beautiful, hopeful, generous question that I would say is impossible to answer. There's no such, you cannot. I mean, the truth is, even those of us who are scholars of Caribbean literature probably haven't even read all of us who've graced the stage this long weekend. The literature is wide and expansive, whether it's the writers who live in the region, the writers who live in the diaspora, it's a large literature. I would say that for those of us who write consciously in the vernacular, as Bobby does, there are parts of my novel that are also in the vernacular, Walcott, Marlon, Kai, Nicole, many of us are doing this consciously, that we hope that we have written it in such a way that when you read it, and I do think that the reading experience is a sonic one. You know, when you read, you hear a voice in your mind. And we hope that we've written it in such a way that you are hearing some version of the speech for yourself. But then you maybe come to a conference and you may hear us read, and then that's yet another experience of the literature. Or there's an audiobook. Often we are not the ones who've done our own audiobooks, especially those of us who are younger writers and have not yet established ourselves enough for the publishing companies to let us do our own audiobooks. So that there's someone else, yet again, giving you a different interpretation of what the sounds should be like. And I think those are all actually completely legitimate representations of the sounds that the novel will want for you to have. I genuinely believe that the writer, be it the Caribbean writer or any kind of writer, does 50% of the work, and then you, the reader, does the other 50%. Which is why critics are important and should not be excused, and why reviews are important and should not be overlooked, because we present you with our work, and then your reading is the completion of the conversation. So we say hello, and you say hello back. And the text, your reading is your part of that conversation. And so how you read it is part of what it is. And hopefully we've done the work with enough complexity and beauty that you're getting something rich out of your experience without us having to perform it for you.
So for my novel, I had to do the audiobook because nobody else could read it.
And also because he's Bobby Antoni and won the Commonwealth Award, and he's famous on them things. So they'll allow him to do it.
But I also
Me did it, let me do mine.
I also wanted to say that Linton Kwesi Johnson is a reggae artist from Jamaica who is best known as for his records, but he's first and foremost a poet. And his book, what's it called? I can't remember the title, but it includes a CD. I want to talk some more about the vernacular. The thing about the vernacular is that it is a fabrication. These languages that you're hearing, nobody speaks that way. Sorry to break it to you. These are all crafted. This is an invitation to you to hear what we hear. So we are leading you into the language. And if we're successful, you will hear it, whether or not you've ever been to the West Indies. So, you know, the idea that writers, you just scribble down what they hear is a real disservice to the writers. Everything that you're hearing up here is just incredibly carefully crafted, you know, in the footsteps of Derek Walcott. There's no poet who crafted so meticulously his language. So that's what we're doing.
There's a question upstairs.
Thank you so much for the wonderful readings. It's been a real honor to be here amongst so many amazing Caribbean writers. My question was just, I guess I'm more in the academic sphere, and so I'm familiar with these critiques of hybridity, some of which came out in the 2000s, but some of which kind of emerged in connection with the Black Power movement. And so I guess going away from Creole as being like a linguistic term to being kind of associated with nationalism in the region and also being a racial term, I was just curious, like, how would that fit in with the hybridity, which I really like, but I was just curious, like, those.
So Madison Smart-Bell was here just before us talking about, among many things, about Haiti and the importance of Haiti in the region, and Creole as an important example for us of hybridity. And we could say that Creolization is yet another way to talk about the multiplicity of the Caribbean region. And that's the term that was used in the 80s and the 90s in academic circles, that the Caribbean was offering a Creolization of humanity that North America was hoping it would make its way towards, with the metaphors that are used in the States of the melting pot or what have you, or the salad bowl, that actually the Caribbean has been doing these things since the Caribbean itself existed. So since there was a thing called the Caribbean, there has been Creolization. There has been two, what were previously separate cultures coming together and inventing a new thing. So I would say that actually, you know, Haitian Creole is a metaphoric example of all our languages. It's a language that has been standardized in Haiti, so it has its own standard and you know, ways that standardized ideas of practicing it. Whereas the vernacular, those of us in the West Indies are often resisting standardization of our vernaculars, maybe because of where we are in history and where Haiti was in history when the Creole came up. But I would say that for many of us, we look to Haiti as an example of this kind of Creolization, and we're doing some of that work consciously in response to Haitian writers who write in Creole. But the Caribbean has always been this place of multiplicity. I mean, in some ways, you don't get to be Caribbean until you are multiple, until you are hybrid. So you don't, an African body doesn't get to be Caribbean until that African body eats some roti, right? Like an Indian body doesn't get to be Caribbean until it could shake its bum bum to some calypso, right? So you have to have all these versions. Like a European body doesn't get to be a Caribbean body until it could snap its fingers appropriately, loudly enough to get everybody's attention, you know? So there's a way in which once a body can perform multiple then that is a Caribbeanized body. And I think most of us in the region, roti isn't Caribbean. Well, it is. I mean, roti now is a Caribbean thing. Even though we can say it's also an Indian thing, there's not a Caribbean person who would argue that it's not a Caribbean thing, right? And that idea of multiple cultures that were previously separated coming together to be one thing is the Caribbean experiment. But it's not in America, in North America, we think of America as a melting pot is an idea. I mean, I think under unfortunate circumstances, one of our senators recently had to explain that to our president, that America is this idea of a coming together of various peoples. It's a beautiful idea. I would actually argue that in the Caribbean, it's not just an idea, and it never has been just an idea, that it's always been our actuality from the beginning of the Caribbean.
So there is no greater claim to individual identity than the claiming of one's own language. Kamal Brathwaite, in that book that he wrote 35 years ago, called it nation language, because he was writing during the time of nation building. So it was important to claim the vernacular as an expression of national identity. And all of the islands did that. All of us have our own vernaculars. My vernacular is very different to Kai's vernacular and Marlon's vernacular. The thing is, those nations now exist. They exist in the West Indies, but they also exist around the world. Brooklyn is a Trinidadian nation. London is a Jamaican nation. And so the global Caribbean literature has moved beyond that idea of an island nationality, and I think has embraced this idea of, a Caribbean person representing multiple spaces that may be worlds away from the small island.
Thank you very much for that wonderful discussion. You mentioned Yanique Louise Bennett, the late Louise Bennett, who was a great Jamaican writer and poet and comedian. Yeah. And as a Jamaican, I sometimes had difficulty reading what she wrote because she wrote it with such deep patois that you had to really slow down to understand what she was saying. But Bobby, I was very impressed by the way you were able to write in your vernacular, or your language, and I understood it because I spent so much time in Trinidad, but everyone else did, and they were cracking up. And I really wondered if you would be willing to share some of the skill sets you used in coming up with the vernacular that was quite authentic, but was understood by everyone in this room.
No.
Give away your secrets. Give away your secrets.
I mean, this question of authenticity has been raised numerous times on this stage over the last 2 days. What is authentic? What's authentic is what I can convince you is authentic. So, that language you're hearing grows out of Trini, but it's it's my invented language. Nobody talks like that. You know, not even my grandmother, who I'm channeling, talks the way I write. I mean, writing in itself is a labor that goes far beyond easy transcription. I could give you 10 simple rules to write vernacular effectively because I'm a school teacher. But I'm not going to do that because that's going to give you the impression that, you know, this stuff you follow the rules and you write it down. It's much more complicated than that, much more difficult than that. And also, I have to say, it's kind of much more thrilling and enjoyable than that. Every time I try to write standard English, I fall asleep. What wakes me up is the invention of those sounds that I'm hearing and hoping to deliver to you.
So I will say one thing, because I can't resist my school teacherness and say a few things about technique. I really appreciate that Bobby is emphasizing that these things are technique driven, because we often think, oh, that's how you speak at home, so it must be so easy for you to just type it out and present it. But that we are all consciously crafting this language in the same way that any writer crafts their narratorial language. I will say, because you mentioned Louise Bennett and you were referencing how she might be different than what Bobby Antoni is doing, one major difference is that she wrote phonetically. So her writing of the patois, she spelled things the way they sounded, which is something that many writers in the Caribbean continue to choose to do. And there's lots of theory, some of it presented by some of our great theorists like Carolyn Cooper and Velma Pollard, also women theorists, as to why spelling phonetically is maybe an important tool. Whereas Bobby Antoni is also, he's not spelling the language, most of it. There are some words in there that are specific Trini like words that don't exist in standard English. But for the most part, it's not being written phonetically. It's being written on a standard alphabet. So that's a difference in the way it looks on the page. So those are some of the choices that we're also making, whether or not to standardize the spelling, to standardize some, and to maybe leave some words that are specific to the vernacular in phonetic spelling. So that's one of the decisions that we're making as we're creating. We have time just for one more question.
Let me just throw something in
or for Bobby
quickly.
to chat.
Yeah. So in Trinidad, they do not spell Wattless, W-H-A-T-L-E-S-S. They used to spell it that way. Now they spell it W-U-T-L-E-S-S or W-A-T-L-E-S-S. So a lot of Trinis would come up to me and say, man, you spelled the thing wrong, you know. The thing is, I'm choosing to give you a spelling that will evoke something. What's that word mean? You know, it means without what. Originally, that's where it came from, and it's vernacular is a living thing. It's growing, it's evolving. So these are the challenges that we face as Caribbean writers. You know, finessing the language in a way that you can receive it. You know, there's always work involved. You know that when you read the title. It's not going to be easy. But for a lot of us, the great pleasure in reading is that, you know, effort that we bring to the task.
So our fastidious timekeeper says that we have time for one more question that Bobby and I will answer succinctly.
Robert, so you make a very careful choice with the vernacular that you use in your writing. And forgive me if the answer to this is in your bio, but do you make the same choice because when you're speaking because you have an American accent?
Yeah. You know, when I came out as a writer, a lot of my trainees said, you have to start talking like a Trini. You can't go up there and talk like a Yankee. But that would be false for me. I grew up in the United States. This is the way I speak. The thing is, the language I write in, the mode that I enter when I write is that language that's on the page. Neither one is the real me. Neither the one using that vernacular or the Yankee-sounding person sitting in this chair. I'm both of those people. You know, I'm always inhabiting both of those spaces. And that's what allows me to write the vernacular the way I do. If I didn't, you would never understand it. It would never be meaningful to you.
So I guess I'll close us up by saying something expansive and particular to the Virgin Islands, which is where I'm from. And because most of us at this seminar are citizens of the United States, I would think that thinking about the Virgin Islands as a space that is actually America's Caribbean. In fact, I think our license plates in St. Thomas actually say that, America's Caribbean. We are a place where there's not a Virgin Islander who was born and raised or even just raised in the Virgin Islands or in the Virgin Islands period who doesn't code switch naturally, who all of us actually have access to the standardized American English that we're taught in schools and that we use in our conversations with our teachers or with tourists who visit the island. And we all also have our versions of the dialect, which is what we call it in St. Thomas and St. Croix and St. John, of our own Caribbean dialect that we speak amongst each other, that we speak in our families, that we speak with our lovers. So for us, in the Virgin Islands in particular, because we are living yet another version of Caribbean identity and Caribbean hybridity, which is we are Americans and Caribbeans at the exact same time. We are also always living on this linguistic hyphen of being able to speak as I'm speaking to you in standard English, and also being able to speak fluently with my Jamaican and Trini counterparts. So for us, whenever you next maybe visit the Virgin Islands, you'll see that in Virgin Islanders and our ability to go back and forth. And in fact, Esmeralda, Santiago, and I are going to have a panel later this afternoon where we'll talk about America's Caribbean spaces, both Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. So looking forward to having you guys there for that as well. Thank you for having us now.